Very good. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is Jeroen Dewulf. I am the director of the University of California, Berkeley Institute of European Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event on border crossings in the old regime, Transregional Perspectives on the Habsburg Low Countries and Austria. Today's event is organized in the context of our Austrian Studies program and our Benelux program at the Institute of European Studies. The event is also co-organized with our partner institution in the Austrian Studies Network in North America, namely the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta, Canada, and also with the Department of History at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. We welcome today Violet Soen and Sophie Verreyken to our program to present their latest book entitled Transregional Territories, Crossing Borders in the Early Modern Low Countries and Beyond, a book that was published with Brepols Press and that pays specific attention to the former Habsburg Empire. Allow me to briefly introduce today's speaker. Violet Soen is Associate Professor of History at KU Leuven and also a former holder of the Peter Paul Rubens Visiting Professorship we have here at UC Berkeley. Violet steers Transregional History, which is a research platform that explores the multiple facets of cross-border exchange and regimes in the ancient regime. This novel approach was distinguished with the Laureate Prize in Humanities of the Royal Academy of Flanders and was awarded to the most innovative researchers under 40 years old. She's editor of the series Habsburg Worlds at Brepols Publishers, and she is accompanied today in our conversation by Sophie Verreyken, who is a teaching assistant and doctoral student at the Early Modern History Department at KU Leuven. She's also a member of the Transregional History program. Sophie Verreyken has worked on the history of the early modern Habsburg polycentric monarchy and its interactions with the old and new worlds. She is currently finishing her dissertation on the political role of transregional marriages among Hispano-Flemish elites in the Spanish Habsburg Netherlands. For today's conversation, I will be assisted by my colleague, Professor Joseph Patrouch, a former Berkeley student who currently serves as director of the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta. I'm very glad that Joe was available to join me for today's conversation because Joe has been doing extensive research on Habsburg history. So a warm welcome to all of you and thank you for taking the time to joining us today. The way things will work is that Violet and Sophie will start with about a 20-minute introduction to their research, to the new book, and that will be followed by a Q&A with Joe and me. During the presentation, all of you in the audience are encouraged to participate at the event, and the way you can participate is by writing down your own questions in the chat function on Zoom. And then my colleague, Julia Nelson, who is assisting us behind the scenes, Julia will be passing on a selection of these questions to me and Joe, and we'll be happy then to make those questions part of our conversation with Violet and with Sophie. I do want to ask people in the audience to please mute yourself during the event and also to turn off your personal videos during the event. Without further ado, allow me now to pass on the floor to Violet to start with a brief presentation. Violet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeroen. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And also thank you for the invitation. It's good to be back in Berkeley after 3 years, even if it's only in a virtual mode. And we're probably all tired of this kind of Zoom surrogate workshops. But I guess in times of restricted travel and restricted border passages, there are convenient alternative to organize this kind of intellectual cross-border and even transatlantic exchange. And so this immediately brings us to at the heart of today's discussion. Even if we like to think of our society as highly globalized and highly interconnected, the COVID pandemic has made painfully clear that our society is not borderless. And this sudden new awareness about the omnipresence of borders ties in, of course, with longer and older debates in our contemporary society about borders and boundaries. Think about recent discussions about borders and eventually walls between California or Mexico, the legal migration restrictions, um, territorial geopolitics, not the least today, unfortunately, again in the Middle East. And so yeah. So it's no coincidence that the leading history journal in America, the American Historical Review, decided during the Trump presidency in 2017 to dedicate a special conversation on these themes of walls, borders, and boundaries in world history, to see how historical thinking can possibly modify some of the premises of ongoing contemporary debates. And I think the main point is that no analysis in history, or for that matter in the human sciences or the humanities, can or should claim to be borderless, as is often happening in a grand scheme of global history or economic history, in which historical actors or historical dynamics are said to be borderless. Our aim should be to think how borders worked, in particular constellations, historical or not, but we should interrogate how they mattered, for whom they mattered, how they mattered, and when they mattered. And so in this large scheme of thinking about borders, historians have always paid a particular attention to pre-modern societies, and especially to the early modern period, especially as at that time, people were not yet married or wedded or embodied with this idea of the nation states as we know them since the 19th century. And one of the pioneers for studying borders in early modern history was certainly and especially one of the professors at the history department of UC Berkeley, Peter Salens, who published just in the week that the Berlin Wall fell. He published his book on boundaries, and he showed that state making in early modern France and early modern Spain could happen as much at their peripheries in the Pyrenees as they would happen in their respective capitals of Paris or Madrid. So early modern borders mattered. They were certainly no less influential on all sorts of human interaction than the borders we actually know today. Even, of course, there were certain technological constraints and challenges to control passages of goods or persons or lands, which were certainly different and less encroaching than today. So recent scholarship on early modern boundaries has moved away a little bit from this state of this paradigm of state formation and rather concentrated on another fundamental tension, and that is this strong link between borders dividing or borders connecting. I think our associated field of borderland studies has highlighted on numerous occasions that there's that territorial boundaries could both divide and connect people. And most often that they did both at the same time. So the place where a division was made between two polities or two religions is evidently also the place where those two entities meet. And so with this in mind, indeed, our team at the University of Leuven, the team of Transregional, history addressed several questions of borders and borderlands history by using a kind of newer transregional perspective, a term which we argued in the Journal of Early Modern History can offer a concept, a method, but as we like to see it more, a concrete tool to think across and along boundaries. And so along with publishing a more general manifesto in the Journal of Early Modern History, we also convened several conferences. And so today we talk indeed about transregional territories, which was the second of these conferences. And in this conference, we invited colleagues of the Benelux, so that's Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, at the crossroads of Europe, the lowlands next to the North Sea, to present their takes on early modern territorial separations and connections. And of course, the Low Countries or the Netherlands can count as one of the many, many fractured regions in pre-modern Europe. But through their specific location, it's pretty clear that we can say that from the Middle Ages on, they also developed in some kind of buffer zone or frontier state between larger territorial agglomerations between France and Germany. And of course, Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but also King of Spain and heir to the Dukes of Burgundy. On the one hand, he made that through inheritance, but also through warfare, and also through legal action, he kind of unified, if that was possible, 17 provinces, and he made them one and indivisible by the mid of the 16th century. But what he also did was, of course, making until the beginning of the 18th century, making the Low Countries the most northern outpost, edge or frontier of a global-wide Spanish monarchy and a Spanish empire. And so you could say that actually the Low Countries offer a perfect laboratory to study this international constellation of borders between France, Germany, Spain, Austria. But if we look at local historiography, or should we say national historiography, then all those borders seem not to matter. Local historiography is always preoccupied with another border. And it's one of the new borders emerging in early modern Europe. And that's the border between the northern and the southern Netherlands, which came about through a long first revolt, but then a long 80 years war in which a lot of conflicts and dividing lines of early modern Europe came together in many divisions, in many alliances. So it was royal versus Republican, Spanish versus Dutch, Calvinist versus Catholic. But the end result was that by the Peace of Munster and the Peace of Westphalia, there was a formal split between the Spanish Habsburg Low Countries, which remained part of the global empire, and the Dutch Republic, which had developed another type of empire. So this new border between the northern and the southern Netherlands largely foreshadowed already the current border between today's Netherlands and today's Belgium. And so that's why some of the current historiography is so focused on the border between North and South. And so transnational and transregional history are mainly developed to prevent or to circumvent this kind of dominant gazes of the states we're still living in, the Netherlands versus Belgium. And what transregional history wants to do is to avoid a simple focus on early modern separations. So what we asked all the participants to do in the conference and later on in their chapters was not to focus any longer on a border. Rather, we invited them to think about multi-level borders or multiple borders. And the second, so we didn't ask persons any longer to reflect on what makes a territory unique or special or separated, but we asked to think what transcended the boundaries of a region. And instead of predefining a border, we asked to follow historical actors as they shifted from one course of action to another in dealing with these multiple borders. And I think it's fair to say, if you read all the chapters together, that this exercise led at least to a decentered perspective on borders in the Low Countries, rather than focusing on the North-South divide. Actually, there was again a tension to focus more on the older border zones between the Holy Roman Empire and France. So we went more to the east, further south. And in fact, the new border between north and south didn't appear so new anymore, as much of the techniques in building that border had, of course, been elaborated on other fronts. In the same movement, I think it became clear that entities like the Franche-Comté, Burgundian Franche-Comté under the Spanish or Austria became corridors or hubs or transit zones. And so this fact of only thinking into clear lines, but also enlarging it to corridors, I think is also a very nice research result. So as a conclusion, one can say that borders matter, and borders became in the early modern period a constituent part of the life of people living in these kind of frontier regions. And the volume shows that historical actors were highly conscious about the presence of borders, and that these separations offered them sometimes limitations, but also sometimes a lot of opportunities. And as borders were made by people, some used the separation to gain an advantage, whereas others sought to avoid or to negate the influence. So I think transregional history offers the nice advantage that it incorporates a sliding scale. So the geographical perspective is not fixed to a certain territory. And so this makes it possible to observe how one border meant one thing to one actor and another thing to another actor. So a border could be closed or open for one actor, whereas others could easily cross it. So this presence of this multi-level and multiple borders forced actors to choose between several options: to cross, to circumvent, to contest, to challenge, to ignore boundaries. But these historical actors mainly reminded us that we always should look for whom the border mattered, when, and why. And now I'll give the floor to Sophie, because she will nicely illustrate how from an actor perspective you can take a different perspective on history in the early modern period.
Thank you, Violet. So what happens if you apply the method of transregional history to the study of early modern marriages, which is the scope of my research? Looking at marriages through the lens of transregional history has broadened the scale of my research, not just at a geographical, but also at a socio-political level. In my research, I have adopted an actor perspective, but I've not only followed individuals as they went looking for a spouse beyond their own parish borders or setting sail across the Atlantic. I've also followed policymakers, from aldermen in small towns to the king and his council in Madrid, as they all dealt with migration and the creation of a truly transregional elite in the Habsburg Empire. The perspective of transregional history has allowed me to observe how the border worked or did not work when the choice of a marriage partner was at stake. In the contribution I wrote for the book we present to you today, I looked on both sides of the border, in this case, or in my case, the territories of the Habsburg Empire, to question how political interests coincided with dynastic ones. Dynastic meaning family-oriented rather than royal in this case. Did the choice of a spouse influence the seat a family could take at the political table, or vice versa? Did the Habsburgs use family politics to their advantage, rewarding or rather discouraging those who married across different territories? The history of the noble Arenberg family offers an insight into this question. The family makes for an interesting case because marriage caused them to settle in the Low Countries in the first place. The Arenbergs had initially risen to prominence in the service of the Holy Roman Emperor, and a branch of the family came down to the Low Countries in the late Middle Ages. A 16th century marriage between the wealthy matriarch Margaret of La Marck Arenberg to Jean of Ligne, a marriage that was said to have been orchestrated by Emperor Charles V himself, consolidated the Arenberg foothold in the Low Countries. Throughout the 17th century, members of the family both cooperated as well as clashed with the Spanish Habsburgs, all the while maintaining their connection to the Austrian imperial branch of the House of Habsburg. Now, was this lasting dual attachment the result of Habsburg politics, or rather the outcome of the family's marital strategy? Traditionally, historians have argued that the existence of transregional elites formed by cross-border marriages were the outcome of a royal strategy to manage and maintain an expansive empire. The Habsburg nobles broadened their horizons as men were posted to different parts of the empire, and their children became meninos, shipped off to be educated at the Madrid court. Now, this heightened mobility also meant that the elite marriage market expanded. Through favor, individuals were uprooted from their local interests, and the idea was that this would forge strong ties and nurture a sense of loyalty towards the House of Habsburg. However, I argue that if we look more closely at these marriages happening at the highest level of political patronage, we see that even these transregional connections, more often than not, were driven by personal interests rather than imperial strategy. Two moments of crisis in the Arenberg family history clearly juxtapose the noble dynastic strategy with political loyalty. The first is the story of conspiracy and treason. The second is one of reconciliation, celebrated almost in true mafioso style with a wedding. In the early 1630s, Philip Charles of Arenberg, Duke of Aarschot, became involved in a conspiracy of nobles against Habsburg rule. François Carondelet, who was ambassador to France, had inspired a group of noblemen to negotiate with Cardinal Richelieu to overthrow the Habsburg regime in the southern Netherlands, and they had elected Arenberg as the head of their movement. So I have a portrait of him in the next slide. I do have to admit that he looks like he's up to no good in this portrait. Anyhow, historians have deemed the conspiracy of 1632 as a breaking point in the political balance between the crown and the local elites in the Low Countries. The nobles' grievances primarily concerned their alleged loss of political power, but more importantly, they believed that the Spanish crown had deliberately orchestrated their weakened position. In the end, however, the conspiracy fell flat, their support of a military coup. 1 year later, in December of 1633, Arenberg found himself at the Madrid court on official diplomatic business when, not completely by coincidence, an English diplomat sold information on the conspiracy to the Count Duke of Olivares, who was the right-hand man to the Spanish King Philip III. Arenberg was then arrested and imprisoned. When he died in 1640, still under house arrest, his wife and children who had joined him in Madrid returned to the Low Countries, with the exception of his eldest son, Philippe François. He was adopted into the household of the young Crown Prince Balthazar Carlos and soon married a girl named Maria Magdalena de Borja y Doria. The marriage had been arranged by the Capuchin monk Juan Muñoz, who acted as Philip's guardian in Madrid after the departure of his mother, and also by Cardinal Gaspar de Borja y Velasco, who was the bride's great uncle. According to some contemporary sources, the king himself had pushed for the arrangement, but until today that remains speculation. While the Borja or Borgias family's reputation had somewhat been tainted by a series of decadent cardinals and popes, at the time of this marriage in 1642, the family again stood at the height of its political and financial power. The marriage to a member of the Borja family provided the Arenbergs with the social, political, and financial boost they needed in the aftermath of the conspiracy. It reconnected the family to the royal court in Madrid, at first physically, but later on, and more importantly, also symbolically. Because even if it remains unclear as to what extent or end the king pushed for an alliance, the mere rumor of a royal interference in both late 17th century sources as well as in current historiography successfully created this image of a noble family returned to favor. Now, if the Borja marriage was testament to the role a transregional marriage could play in the recovery of royal favor, the double wedding that took place in the 1680s, about 50 years later, illustrates that these marital ties could also tip the scales of political loyalty in another direction. Now, what happened? In 1682, a unique opportunity arose when a new governor general named Otto Henry del Carretto arrived in the Low Countries in the company of his oldest daughter. The then new Duke of Arenberg, Philip Charles Francois, was about to turn 19, and he himself was a sought-after match. Soon a wedding was in the making. Del Carretto, the Governor General, was a widower. He had recently turned 54 and himself was in want of a new wife. The wedding thus turned into a double feast when Del Carretto took Arenberg's younger sister, Marie-Thérèse, as his new bride. On this occasion, these marriages were negotiated and concluded in the Netherlands themselves and merely ratified in Madrid. The Spanish king and his court seemed to have little to do with forging the relationships between the two noble houses. Presumably, it was even Maria Magdalena de Borja, who I mentioned before in the 1630s wedding. She was the aunt to both the Arenberg siblings. It is said that she was the one who dusted off old family ties between the Borjas and Del Carrettos. And that is because the Del Carretto family had moved from the island of Sicily to the Piedmont region, close to the city of Genoa in the north in the 16th century, where the Spanish Habsburgs had bestowed them with lordships. This close to the Alps, however, Vienna's influence became stronger than Madrid's. By the 17th century, members of the Del Carretto family had entered the Hofburg's inner circles. Otto Henry Del Carretto's father, for example, had served as the imperial ambassador in Madrid, and his mother was a member of the notorious Fugger family of bankers, and she was also a lady in waiting at the imperial court. The Governor General had previously married into a family of imperial counts, and his children were born and raised in Vienna. Marrying into this Del Carretto family not only brought along territorial expansion in the Austrian Habsburg territories, but also a direct link to the court in Vienna. And as a result, the Arenberg almost transformed into Austrian servicemen. Philippe Charles Francois, you can see in the slide, he himself died in 1691 while serving with the imperial forces in a battle against the Ottoman Empire. In conclusion, as transregional history seeks to connect what sometimes seems to have been strictly delineated territories with what is happening outside of them, I hope to have given you a glimpse into how families such as the Arenbergs, tied to both the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, were able to navigate the many boundaries of continental Europe to further their own cause. The Spanish crown recognized this mobility of its aristocracy along, across and beyond its borders, and they tried to handle the multiple identities that resulted from this. Now, in the short presentation, I can only tease you, of course, with a summary of what I wrote. If you're interested in finding out more about the nuts and bolts of this story, or if you want to learn more about crossing borders in the early modern Low Countries, I suggest you should buy or read our book. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Violette and Sophie, for this short but very insightful introduction to your book. We can now start our conversation, our Q&A, and let me also remind all of you in the audience that if you would like to participate in the conversation, please do post your questions in the chat function, and we will be happy to pass these questions on to today's speakers. But let me start the conversation with a question I prepared myself, and it's actually wonderful to see how, thanks to Zoom, we're able to connect people from all over the world to this lecture. And I was very excited to see that one of the people who joined us is Professor Prevenier, Walter Prevenier, who honors us today with his presence. And Walter Prevenier was actually one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of our Rubens chair here at Berkeley that brought Violette to Berkeley a couple of years ago. And I do remember, Violette, in one of the conversations we had about the course that you were teaching here in Berkeley, that you said in the context of your course, I'm teaching about a time in history when Berkeley and my home university in Belgium, Leuven, when Berkeley and Leuven were part in a way of the same country, right? They were part of this gigantic Habsburg empire that included, of course, large parts of Europe, the Americas, the Philippines, and it brings up the topic of identity, right? The topic of what did people in this gigantic empire share. And of course, I think about religion, but my question to you is, was there perhaps more? Was there such a thing, at least for some people in this empire, was there such a thing as a Habsburg identity? Did some people identify themselves and perceive themselves as being Habsburgian? Was there perhaps something as a Habsburg pride in the context of this empire? And of course, I understand that this was different from place to place, and definitely also different according to social status. But I wonder if the two of you could elaborate a little bit on this. And let me start with Violette, perhaps, and then Sophie can also tune in if she wants. Violette.
Thank you, Jeroen, for this question, which is probably haunting much of our historiography, and how much what rulers did and united led to a different set of thinking, different regional belongings. And of course, it was not as clear cut as the nation state, but I do think that this territorial agglomeration added another level of identity to people living in parts of the Habsburg Empire. Um, so I think like the latest work really is on Habsburg studies in the Spanish Habsburg Empire, is mainly showing how much Catholicism, Virgin Mary, the Immaculate Conception, how actually going from Manila to Mexico to Halle in Belgium. So this would be the same Mary, the same at the same moment all over the empire. There the same things happening. On the other hand, this of course doesn't elude like regional or local or provincial identities. And so I think we should always think of early modern persons as in their multiple identities. In one other work, we've called this an identity stock. People had an identity stock, and it depended upon their interlocutor, how they reacted and which card they played. So if we take the Arenberg, if we take the Croix, their predecessors, it depended if they talked to the French king or, of course, the Habsburg ruler, on which card they played. And we also see this for citizens, for example, living in these frontier regions. The city of Lille, Rijssel, which is today north of France, but which used to be, since the Burgundians, part of the county of Flanders. Such citizens played towards the King of France more this allegiance of we've once been part of France, and to the Duke of Burgundy they said we're Flemish, we're Burgundian Flemish. So and that's why I really think that this actor perspective can kind of circumvent a lot of this identity debates, because it shows that identities are always in flux, but also there's a rich or there are always multiple identities for individuals. And I think it's our task as historians to see on which place, on which moment you say what. And you can have the very same person saying I'm French or I'm Flemish or I'm Habsburg in different contexts. And I think if historiography has to move forward in one direction, then I would suggest that we start looking at we've called it in another word like identity games. It's not really a game because it's not purely calculated, but it's changing, in flux, and it really depends on where you are and not only on when things happen.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, let's Sophie, do you want to say something about this question as well?
Yes, I would just add, and I agree with Violet, it's something that's best studied case by case, and that it will always remain difficult to pin down anything that might resemble a Habsburg identity. What I've learned from my own research is that there are a few common denominators, a few markers, I guess, that pop up often. The first one might have been Roman Catholicism, but I also think the possibilities of mobility, the ease with which people moved or could move, played a role. And the idea that the Habsburg Empire did provide a sort of historical template on which they could reflect their own history. So, of course, grand noble houses such as the Arenberg, they constantly use these links with Austria and Spain in an attempt to legitimize their own actions. And it's using, but also identifying with, because otherwise I think this would never work. So I think there might be a few markers we could pin down, but then again, for every example you find, I think I'm sure you'll find a counter one as well. But it's you're right, it's an interesting discussion. And
yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Joe, let me go to you for your first question. Joe, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the two interesting presentations. And Jeroen, thank you for the invitation to participate in this. The Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta up here in Canada is enthusiastically interested in working with both the Berkeley Center and all of our other centers. I see representatives here actually from a couple other Austrian centers around the world. I welcome the colleagues from there as well. Your first comment, Jeroen, about Leuven and Berkeley and being under the same empire reminds me that when I used to teach courses for 20 years, I taught in Miami in Florida, and I used to talk to my students in my Habsburg course that for much of the time, the Habsburgs ruled this territory longer than it had been part of the United States, right? Florida was longer part of the Habsburgs than it was part of the United States. I don't think that's the case anymore. Time marches on, but that was a statement that would start the class, and people would be a little bit surprised by this and say, "What? You know, Florida was part of this empire, which went to Vienna, which went to Madrid, where it went to the Philippines, whatever." So, yeah, studying the Habsburgs gives us a very different perspective on things, right? And this idea of multiple identities related to Habsburg rule, I think, is also something that you see once you start getting into this family and going with it all over the world, basically. I do also want to mention just briefly that I'm coming to you from Canada, and it seems that I'm based on being here on the North Saskatchewan River in the middle of the prairies, that I'm not very close to a border, but actually Edmonton, the city, the capital of Alberta, is a historic crossroads and a border town where many different nations and cultures have come together over time. We are on the border between the territories of the peoples of the plains to the south, where they came up north here to meet with the peoples of the woods to the north. To the west, we have the peoples of the mountains who would come together here in Edmonton. And then eventually in the late 18th, early 19th century, the peoples of Europe came downstream, or basically upstream, I guess, to join us here in Edmonton. So Edmonton may seem on a map now to look like it's in the middle, But historically, it was very much on the edge. It was very much a border place, and it has many different names too associated with it. And so my questions, I have a couple, and there's so many of the topics you raised are so close to my heart. Studying dynastic, studying marriages, for example, marriage diplomacy. Sophie, I could talk with you for hours, I think, about this, but there's some practical issues involved. And maybe, Violet, I can start with asking you, when you come up with this transregional approach, what sources does one use to look at these topics? So what would you say? I can imagine, for example, cartographic evidence might be appropriate, or could you just talk a little bit more about the kind of sources that one would use in order to understand these border regions?
It's a very interesting question, I think, for me, and I think it's a really fundamental point for me that border historians should actually go to archives at both sides of the border. And this seems a platitude, but it's unfortunately often not the case that you go to the other side of the border. And so I'm most interested right now on the border zone between the Low Countries and France, and of course this means Low Countries, France, but also England. So there are actually already 3 constellations there, of course this is a historical border region in the sense that since the 100 Years' War up until the Second World War, there's been a lot of war going on, but also a lot of damage to the historical source record. I think what makes transregional history interesting is that you read against the grain. You're asking questions that actually people at the time did not ask. And I think that's often a very good starting point, because you kind of go against their narratives and their sources, how they see the world. But we've used transregional history now for all kinds of themes. So there's a PhD on book history, there's a PhD on border management, there's Sophie on marriages, there's also a PhD going on universities and borderlands. But I think it's mainly like a way to think differently about location, because historians are always very preoccupied with change over time, but we are very naive in what spaces do with people. And so I think it's just looking differently at what remains of a historical source record. And of course, cartography can be great, but I think it's, especially for the early modern period, kind of misleading, because it's the emergence of the cartography. But of course, there again, in how worldviews or mental worlds were made, it's only one of the possible viewpoints. If you look at border conflicts, for example, farmers do not come with the cartographic point of view. They come with designs, like how they see their world. Or sometimes border conflicts, like territorial border conflicts between France and Spain, happen by interviewing the farmers. So it's not cartographically a border, it's about going to the border and interviewing the people. And so, yeah, there's a marvelous episode of the Treaty of Canton Complaisy where the Spanish want the inspection of the border by viewing the border. So they want inspection oculaire, so you have to view it. And then the French wanted to do it with cartography and by interviewing the farmers. And at the moment they arrive, the farmers say, well, there's a lot of clouds, we don't see anything. So the Spanish can actually not see the border. So I think, like cartography, it's great that it's the era in which cartography is introduced, but also a lot of our Google Maps, or the fact that we look in that way, sometimes is also a little disorienting for, I think, the historical world map.
Yeah, just personally, anecdotally, talk about going to sources on both sides of the border, or going to archives on both sides of the border. You mentioned Marshall Solins in 1989 and the release of that book. I remember 1989 and how excited we were that we could get over the border now, right? I was living in Austria at the time, and we were almost giddily just going back and forth across the border and contacting Czech colleagues, up there. And I remember conferences along the border, because suddenly that border was something we could study from both sides. It wasn't just, the Czechoslovak view of the border or the Austrian view of the border. We were kind of hopping back and forth and, just excited about the chance to see the border from both sides, right? The cartographic issue, I'm very interested though in, so I'm working a lot right now with Ortelius's Atlas of 1570, and it does give you some insight into how some people saw the world and the borders, but of course, yeah, it doesn't give everything. There's a lot of narrative descriptions of borders. If you use judicial records, for example, these court cases, as you're pointing out, walking the borders, looking for trees or stumps or whatever thing that marks the border is a different way of imagining a border. But I don't want to monopolize things. I think if I understand the rules of the game, Jeroen, you're next.
Yeah, I would be next, and maybe I can follow up with a question for Sophie, because I just had a look at the chat and I saw that we already have one question that I think is primarily directed towards you, Sophie. It's a question from Chris Jackson, also a historian. A question about marriage policy. In the specific case of the Arenberg family that you presented to us. And his question is, which do you suppose counted for more? The ostensible political gains of a particular marriage, or the idea of moving up in terms of rank of nobility? What would be your answer, Sophie?
Okay, thank you for that's an interesting question. A difficult one as well. It really depends on the case you look at, because in the two cases I presented, the first marriage, when the eldest son of the Arenbergs was imprisoned at court, he was kept there, he wasn't allowed to return to the Low Countries. In that case, he was they were social equals to the Borja family, but there was definitely a financial gain in the marriage. So the Arenbergs' means were sufficiently or remarkably less. There's even a passage in correspondence between the future Duke and his stepmother, where he's worried that he won't be able to buy his new bride a necklace, a fancy necklace, even though her dowry far exceeds that amount. So I would say that it depends. The rank sometimes does have to do with it, but most of these decisions, it's difficult to see these marriages in the long term or in the long run. There's always you can identify a sort of family strategy, but it changes with the times. So depending on the needs and on the possibilities, I'd say the balance tips from one to the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Let me go back to Joe.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that issue, Sophie, of long-term versus short-term strategies, because that's something I was thinking about. I just read William Godsey and Veronica Hayden-Hancho's book or collection of essays on the Arenberg family. And I think in the preface or the introduction, they say or write something like, in order to understand this dynasty, you have to put it in the long term, right? They cover from the 16th to the 20th century. Do you agree, or do you think that that would obscure things because it's always shifting? Is it better to look closely? The examples you gave are very specific to a particular moment. But on the other hand, I could imagine, as Godsey and Hayden-Hancho do, Hancho do have a broader long-term perspective. Which would you prefer? What do you think?
I think you can't neglect neither, because as I've mentioned before, they were aware of the fact that they are a noble dynasty with a long history, and they know how to use it when they need to. So it's in my contribution. I haven't talked about it now, but in the 1640s, the Arenbergs, they are named Arenberg because they come from a place called Arenberg in the Holy Roman Empire, but they carry or they hold the title of Duke of Aarschot. And in the 1640s, they get the title Arenberg back. So and then there's a lot of debate in Madrid whether they are allowed to carry two noble titles from a different ruler, or even if it's the same house. So I would say, you know, you need to go back and forth. It's the same question with identity, the awareness of the fact that there are multiple currents running along each other, the opportunities in the moment, but the awareness of a legacy, of a history, that you should always balance those two out.
Though I think, Jeroen, I see that our colleague from New Orleans has a question. Should we move to the chat here? And
why don't you read the question, Joe?
Mark Landry. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I'm curious if either of you could speak about the role of environment, either perceptions or material impacts on these border crossings. Do any of your sources shed light on these aspects? So environment.
Yeah.
Maybe Violette, if anything comes to mind.
Yeah. Yes, so this is, I think, one of the main challenges of doing this kind of research. Like I always, when I do these exercises with students, I always press them, like, think how you cross borders. And I think the hardest thing to think through is the nature and the environment, because we're, as historians, trained to look through this kind of like paperwork, the administration, the court dealings, or whatever comes up in the historical record. But actually the border crossing is often like going through a field and seeing a kind of stone, a borne, and that's how you know that you cross, if you're not crossing rivers and so on. But then there's huge forests which are kind of natural borders, and if you look today on maps, you don't, of course you don't see them anymore. Just so thinking through like all the forests which have been gone, and which were kind of like natural frontiers, is so difficult. And on the one hand, it's great we have Google Maps and satellites to know about height difference and so on. But of course, geography changes the whole time, and I think it's a very relevant point to this kind of research.
Yeah. Violette, we're coming close to the end of our event, but I do want to still ask an interesting question that Robin Radway passed on to us, specifically for you, Violette. So you mentioned the challenge of moving beyond national historiographies in order to do this kind of work. I'm curious about the possibilities of doing this on a micro or level. As a historian of the Austrian Habsburgs, when I'm trying to find some information on the individuals, I often have to rely on the Biographie Nationale de Belgique or another national biographical project. I see borders everywhere, some of them rather anachronistic. Is there, so that's the question, is there a broader digital humanities project underway to trace these border crossings, users, etc.?
So there's two projects currently carried out by the Royal Archives of Belgium in trying to reconstruct historical boundaries. So what they will normally develop in 4 to 5 years is they of course have to work with limited samples. So they will do the County of Flanders and the Duchy of Brabant, but you will be able to see how the boundaries of a confined territory change. That's another thing than the thing which you are asking as well, to map all these border crossings and users. And currently in the project on university history, we are using digital humanities to map students coming and going to other universities. So if you're interested in students and scholars moving, then I can give you some pre-views on what we are developing.
Yeah, thank you, Violette. Maybe Joe, go back to you just for some final thoughts, final reflections on this topic.
Well, I would say that these are not final thoughts. These are just the beginning, right? I mean, all the people out here, I'm glad Robin's here from the CEU and all these people around. We can take advantage of the opportunities presented to us by the COVID virus to connect up in ways that we hadn't connected up before. We were talking right before this program started about how now, as a result of this, the University of Alberta and the KU Leuven are going to be having a student exchange program, which was put together partly, I mean, not because of us, but it moved together in that direction because of this movement, this event. I think we are in a good situation now to bring together scholars from Canada, the United States, Belgium, Austria, wherever, to talk about the Habsburgs or trans-regional history in a different perspective, from a different set of perspectives. So I would just say that stay tuned for all the stuff that's probably going to come out of these possible connections and the conversations we can have about Arenbergs, who had property from France to Germany to Austria to Italy, and I think even a little bit in Belgium and the Netherlands and all over the place. As Robin points out, the techniques that we had for studying these things and the technologies we used to have, old national bibliographies, for example, are obsolete. And we have to replace them with something. So I'm encouraging everybody here to think about how best to do that, right? And I really think that Violet and Sophie's research and this project is a great step in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. So let me then, I see that unfortunately we will have to conclude our event at this point, and let me do so by thanking first of all my colleague Julia Nelson, who has assisted us behind the scene, and Julia will actually follow up with a short survey for all of you. A big thank you to Joe Patrouch, my dear colleague from the University of Alberta. A big thank you to all of you in the audience. It was wonderful to see some familiar faces joining us today for today's event. That was great. And of course, a big thank you to today's speaker, Soen and Sophie Verreyken from KU Leuven, for a wonderful presentation, for being with us during the Q&A. And so thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at future events here at the Institute of European Studies. So thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you, Jeroen. Bye.